was preparing this year, I wanted to think about how Pesach is going to look different this year for us, in many ways, obviously, and how I can help address some of those differences. And it seemed to me that the overarching issue is going to be creating a real Chag atmosphere. How are we going to make this Pesach feel like an actual holiday? Um, we're going to go through the routine. We're going to read the Haggadah. We're going to say all the tefillot. We're going to not eat our chametz, and yet it's going to feel different. Um, and I think that really boils down to the question of Simchat Yom Tov. What does Simchat Yom Tov look for us this year? Usually Pesach, I think that usually means for people a very exciting, boisterous, big Lela Seder, and then Chol Hamoed Tiyulim, getting outside, shedding that winter heaviness. And all of those things they're not going to be present this year. And I wanted to think about how we can maybe reframe our Simchat Yom Tov for this year, in ways that can still make Pesach feel like a Chag and still bring that into our homes. And I want to say before we jump into the sources, I want to say that obviously I'm not talking about diagnosed depression. Those are questions that should be addressed with a therapist. I'm talking about what I'm going to call the isolation blues. How can we sort of overcome that and create an atmosphere of Simchat Yom Tov? So if you look at the sources, this is not the first time Simchat Yom Tov has posed a real question for the Jewish people. After the destruction of the temple, Chazal needed to ask themselves, how do we possibly fulfill Simchat Yom Tov on two levels, both because we're more in mourning and it's very hard to create that atmosphere of Simcha, but also from a technical aspect that the Simchat Yom Tov was really bringing a sacrifice to the Mikdash, bringing the Shalmei Simcha, and sitting and eating a festive meal with your family. And how can I possibly do that without a temple? And so there's a machloket in Tractate Beitzah between Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua about how to fulfill this commandment. I don't want to get into the details of their machloket. It's not really relevant for this. But what I can say is that they both, I think there are two things we can take from the way they both address this question. First of all, Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua both frame the question with the assumption that Chag is going to look different. We are not going to be able to fulfill Simchat Yom Tov the way we did last year. There's no temple anymore. We can't do it. And for us, we can say, we're not going to have that big boisterous Seder. We're not going to have those Tiyulim. It's going to be different. And I think even just acknowledging that reality and setting our expectations that this year Pesach is going to have to be different and not comparing it to last year is already a huge step in the right direction, right? We're not going to have what we had last year, but that doesn't mean we can't have true Simchat Yom Tov in a different way. The other thing that I want to take from them is that both Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua break down the Simchat Yom Tov into its elements. They sort of look back at what it was to bring that sacrifice in the temple and say, okay, within that, what made the Simchat Yom Tov? There were two aspects. There was the spiritual aspect of the closeness to God, as well as the material aspect, not in a negative sense, but the physical aspect of eating and drinking and being with my family. And their debate is about how to balance those two elements. But I think that the idea of breaking down our Simchat Yom Tov into elements, to ask ourselves, what is it that gave us Simcha last year, and how can we then take those elements and reapply them to our current reality, can be very helpful for us, as well in framing how we're going to think about our Simchat Yom Tov this year. Continuing in that vein, the fact that they bring in the idea of spirituality, I think is something that we don't think about too much when we think about Simchat Yom Tov. We often think about the things that I mentioned at the beginning of family and being able to go outside and all the extra joys that we get from Chag. And we don't necessarily think about the spiritual aspect as Simcha. But in fact, if you look at the psukim in the Torah, that's actually what the Simcha is. The Torah talks about V'samachta many times, both in the context of the holidays as well as other contexts, but they almost always involve bringing something to the temple. And the verse doesn't just say V'samachta, it says V'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha. You're supposed to rejoice before God. the joy comes from the closeness with God. It comes from the spiritual aspect. It's not, yes, you get to afterwards have a festive meal with your family, but the spiritual aspect is really the focus. The idea is rejoicing with God, not necessarily even with your family. That is in the verses as well, but it begins with God. And maybe this year, with our lack of hustle and bustle, maybe this is the perfect time to sort of focus on that spiritual aspect of Simchat Yom Tov, to focus on prayer, to focus on maybe bring a new song, learn some extra Torah, whatever it is that might bring God a little bit closer, even for just a moment. That is Simchat Yom Tov, and that can add to the joy of your holiday. However, moving beyond Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Yoshua, there are other ways that we can bring Simcha into our holiday that come up in other sources as well. In Tractate Psachim, this question also comes up of how can we create this atmosphere of Simchat Yom Tov. And what I like about this source is that I think it acknowledges that sometimes in times of crisis, you don't really even know what you need. And sometimes setting aside your own needs is the answer. What the source says is, it quotes the pasuk of Samachta b'chagecha, that you should rejoice in your feast. But instead of focusing on the fact that the verse says you should rejoice, Chazal ask, "But memesamcham, how can I cause others to rejoice?" The assumption is that in order to feel joy myself, I need to cause others to rejoice in order to be with me. And then follows a list of sort of what men like and what women like and what children like and what makes everyone happy. And see no reason we have to keep to the exact stereotypes of that list. But the idea that sort of being able to create that joy, create that happiness for someone else, sort of just set aside my own needs for a minute, that itself is a fulfillment of Simchat Yom Tov as well. I've also seen this idea a lot, just in general, in combating the isolation blues of sort of how to overcome the difficulties the emotional and psychological difficulties that we're all feeling right now. This idea of sort of doing something for someone else, as hard as that might be when I'm struggling to meet my own needs. Reach out, think about how you can cause someone else to rejoice, and that itself, that's a huge part of Simchat Yom Tov. So whether you do it before Chag or after, I strongly encourage you to think about a way that you can bring joy in general to your community, to your neighbor, colleague, friends, family, whoever it is, and that will help infuse your own holiday with joy as well. I hope this helped give a little bit of perspective on Simchat Yom Tov in these trying times. I wish everyone a true Chag Sameach in every sense of the word. May this be a very joyful holiday for us, and may next year's Pesach we be able to return to our usual forms of Simchat Yom Tov. Chag Sameach.